In March 2025, a United Nations report placed Burkina Faso's soldiers and terrorists on the same list of violators. That legalistic act did not land like a neutral spreadsheet. It landed like an insult. It struck a nerve that runs from the barracks to the markets, from the desert roads to the crowded courtyards where families gather at dusk. What happens when the world's guardian of peace writes your name next to the very people who burn your villages? Is that justice, or is that the spark that turns pain into defiance? This is where our story begins, in the hard light of numbers that travel faster than truth. The report counted 2,483 grave violations, affecting 2,255 children. It stated that a clear majority, about 65%, were carried out by jihadist groups that have torn the Sahel for years. It also logged the remainder as the responsibility of state forces and local auxiliaries known as volunteers for the defense of the fatherland. On paper, it was a ledger. On the ground, it read like an accusation that refused to see the war for what it is. If you are watching from New York, Atlanta, or Oakland, ask yourself this: would the United States accept being placed on the same list as Al-Qaeda because a report compiled allegations from a war zone? Would France accept standing shoulder to shoulder with the Islamic State inside a catalog of violations because its soldiers were accused in the fog of conflict? If the answer is no, then you can understand why people in Ouagadougou bristled, why the air turned electric, and why the phrase persona non grata would soon echo through the capital. The core message of this film is simple and relentless. A United Nations report put Burkina Faso's soldiers and terrorists on the same list of violators, and that legalistic act ignited a firestorm of national defiance. Every scene you will see flows from that spark. Every voice you will hear is a different echo of the collision between a global institution and a country fighting for its life. To grasp the collision, you have to feel the terrain. This is Burkina Faso, a land at the heart of the Sahel, where lines on the map are straight but life is not. For years, armed groups have targeted schools, markets, convoy routes, and places of worship. Families have learned to pack quickly and to pray quietly. Soldiers and volunteer fighters patrol roads that disappear into heat and dust. In this brutal geography, accusations are not only words. They shape how aid flows, how diplomacy moves, and how the world decides who gets protection and who gets pressure. Now, from the United Nations perspective, the listing was a standard procedural tool. It was not meant as a moral equivalence, but as a factual record of violations from all parties, intended to trigger action and protection. That is the legal nuance. But nuance fades when you place soldiers and terrorists on the same line. In Ouagadougou, and in garrison towns far from the capital, the ledger read like a pronouncement without a courtroom. People asked, who investigated these claims? Where are the case files? Where are the judgments? Who stood in the villages that changed hands 3 times in a month? Who spoke to the families of the soldiers who never came back from the ambush road? This is also a story about voice and power. In global halls where resolutions are drafted, lists can look tidy. In African geopolitics, especially in a place battered by shifting alliances, nothing is tidy. The Sahel Alliance, the idea of Africa rising, the renewed push for African sovereignty, and the old and new currents of Pan-Africanism all shape the way this single report was received. When you hear the name Ibrahim TRAORÉ in this film, you will hear more than a title. You will hear a generational claim that says the age of quiet obedience is over. There is another reason this moment resonates, beyond Burkina Faso. For many Black viewers across the Atlantic, the feeling of being criminalized by default is not foreign. This is not an abstract policy debate. It brushes against a long memory, a memory that says institutions can bless a narrative before they verify a fact. That is why the question at the heart of this chapter is not only about one country. It is about who draws the line between protection and punishment. It is about who defines a community under siege and who is allowed to defend it. So we open with a question, and we will ask it again. What happens when the slow language of international procedure meets the fast pain of a country under attack? The answer is layered. It is political, it is emotional, it is legal, and it is deeply human. It touches the gold economy that funds survival and strategy. It touches regional blocs and sanctions that press on borders and choices. It touches conversations about BRICS Africa and new partnerships that promise independence, and about old pressures that demand compliance. You will hear voices from the ground, and you will hear the names that make headlines. Ibrahim TRAORÉ, Burkina Faso, the Sahel. You will hear phrases that carry both history and hunger, like African sovereignty, Africa rising, and the Pan-African movement. You will hear the tension in a relationship often framed as Traoré versus France, and you will see how that tension shapes choices in the field and speeches at night. This is African politics, explained without euphemism, not to flatter any flag, but to follow evidence and emotion to the same place. The numbers are real. The fear is real. The courage is real, and the anger is real. Before the defiance came the evidence, or the lack of it. Next, the proof, the pain, and the pronouncement. A United Nations report placed Burkina Faso's soldiers and terrorists on the same list of violators, and that legalistic act ignited a firestorm of national defiance. This is the line we will follow. But who drew that line? And what gave them the right? Before the defiance, there was a document. It was dry by design, clinical by necessity, written to be a ledger rather than a speech. The United Nations framed it as a tool, a map of harm intended to guide protection. In the UN report Burkina Faso 2025, the findings were grouped, tallied, and coded in careful language that could cross offices and time zones. It said, in effect, here are the violations, here are the actors, here is the pattern. It was meant to be African politics explained through numbers. What did the document actually say? First, it logged the recruitment and use of children. Not only boys in ragged uniforms, but girls used as couriers and lookouts, and sometimes as the first witnesses to violence no child should ever see. The text did not linger on faces. It marked incidents and counted. Second, it recorded sexual violence. Behind those lines are broken bodies, silenced voices, and communities that carry scars in public and in private. Third, it documented attacks on schools. Classrooms turned into ruins leave a silence that lives longer than any headline. Teachers who once graded papers now count escape routes. Fourth, it recorded the detention of children, sometimes held on suspicion or rumor, because confused rules left no other box to place them in. To the drafters, these categories are standard. They are the architecture of a system that tries to name what should never be normal. But to the people who live where these lines were born, categories and codes can feel like a shield for distance. In towns where teachers now carry more fear than chalk, the phrase "attack on a school" is not a box to tick. It is a memory that arrives at night and refuses to leave before dawn. From the UN's perspective, this listing is procedural. It is not a moral equivalence. It is, as spokespeople say, a factual record designed to trigger action and protection. But nuance fades when you put soldiers and terrorists side by side on paper. On a page, two names separated by a comma can look like twins. In a life lived under threat, that comma can feel like a knife turned sideways. The report worked with sources that the system trusts. Field monitors, interviews, partner agencies, and program data were assembled into a single frame. The compilers did not claim to be a court. They did not pronounce guilt or innocence. They produced a record and asked the world to act on it. In design terms, the form is meant to force attention, to move diplomats, to shift budgets, and to shape behavior in the field. It is a pressure instrument. There is a case for that instrument. Without a comprehensive list, pressure cannot be applied, and without pressure, children suffer first and last. Documentation can save lives, but it can also flatten a story until it no longer resembles the world it seeks to change. Consider how these lines read where they were written. A parent does not study a matrix. A parent reads the absence of a child. A soldier does not debate footnotes. A soldier remembers the convoy that never returned. When a report lists a state force next to a group that burned a market, calling it a procedural juxtaposition does not soften the blow, it hardens it. There is also the problem of time. Villages can change hands more than once in a month. Roads can open at noon and close at sunset. Who measures the space between alleged and proven when witnesses cannot return? When a commander holds a line so a school can be evacuated, Where does that choice appear in a table? This chapter is not a defense of any violation. It is a demand for clarity at the same depth as the harm. If you are going to list the actors, describe the terrain. If you are going to count incidents, count the context that makes some choices look like cruelty when they were in fact desperate shields against worse outcomes. If you are going to place a state on a page beside insurgents, show your chain of custody for every claim the way a courtroom would before it risks a reputation. Supporters of the report will say that the same grammar used elsewhere must be used here because standards resist bias. They will note the methods and thresholds. All true. And still, a list can be a mirror or a label. Once a label sticks, it travels faster than nuance. It can shape aid, and it can shape debate. And it can change how a country is seen by people who will never stand on its soil. This is where African geopolitics stops being theory and becomes survival. Reality is not neat. It includes volunteer fighters who stood between their families and the morning raid, and officers barely older than their troops who learned leadership in a single, terrible afternoon. It includes children who skip school because the path bends through a place where men once appeared and did not need to return to haunt it. So what are we to do with a report that tries to be both mirror and map? We begin by reading it as if the stakes are ours. We ask who gathered the testimonies, who translated pain into paragraphs, and who verified that accusation is not rumor. When a state loses a town at midnight and retakes it at sunrise, where does that cycle appear in the tables that assign blame? There is another question. Who is accountable when a list becomes a label? If a document meant to protect ends up branding a nation, who carries the weight of that brand? If compilers say we did not judge, we only recorded, and the audience hears, you judged us, what bridge remains between procedure and perception? We are not done with the numbers. We will not look away from the pain they represent. But the language of protection must not become a subtle form of punishment. The phrase, UN Report, Burkina Faso 2025, must not float above the ground like a satellite. It must land, listen, and learn what the ground already knows. The grammar of global concern must not erase the cadence of a people who refuse to be described only by their worst days. This is the stage. These are the numbers. This is the argument the report makes for itself, and the argument the country hears in reply. In the next chapter, we will track the current from ledger to outrage, from paragraph to policy, from a comma on a page to a decision at a podium. We will hold the institution to its own promise, and we will hold the nation to its own hope. The numbers were the match. Pride and sovereignty were the tinder. By the time the report's tables reached the ministries and the barracks, the reaction had already traveled ahead of them, carried by radio chatter, market talk, and late-night messages that threaded families together. If Chapter 2 set the document on the table, this chapter sets the heartbeat beside it and asks why a nation felt the blow as an injury and not a footnote. Reason 1 begins with dignity. To be a state is to claim both the right and the burden to protect your people. When a report places the national army on the same line as the insurgents who terrorize villages, that line reads like a denial of legitimacy. To many in Ouagadougou and to soldiers in dusty forward posts, the juxtaposition was more than grammar. It was an affront to national honor, the suggestion that the shield had become indistinguishable from the blade. Would the United States accept being equated with Al-Qaeda? Would France accept being listed alongside ISIS? Ask it plainly and the answer is obvious. No country tolerates a sentence that dissolves the moral distinction between those who defend civilians and those who hunt them. For Burkina Faso, that sentence felt like a stain on the uniform and a shadow across the flag. Dignity is not a costume. It is a lived agreement between citizens and those who risk their lives for them. A mother will not sleep easier if the world tells her that the men guarding the road to the clinic stand on the same line as the men who lay mines in it. A teacher will not open a classroom if the global label on the uniform at the door reads no different from the label on the gun in the bush. In that sense, the first reason is not rhetoric. It is the ground truth of national life. The accusation may be procedural on paper, but on the ground it sounds like the erasure of purpose. It is here that African sovereignty stops being a slogan and becomes the daily insistence that a nation defines itself, especially in war. Reason 2 is evidence, or the absence of it. People asked the same questions in court language because the stakes were the same as any trial of reputation. Where's the investigative file? Where are the sworn statements? Where are the judgments that a bench would issue before it brands a uniform? Without a visible chain of custody for claims, a catalog can feel like rumor bound into hardcover. In a country where a village can change hands twice in a week, where witnesses flee and return to find new flags on the same pole, who measures the distance between alleged and proven? What does due process look like when the docket is a desert road and the archive is a memory that had to run for its life? You could hear the legal frustration in how people retold the report to one another. They did not deny the duty to protect children. They did not excuse cruelty. They demanded a method that respected the law as much as it invoked the law. If a document will name a state actor, then let it show the steps a judge would require. Present the time, the terrain, the witnesses, and the cross-checks. Distinguish the chaos of a night firefight from the malice of a deliberate act. Draw a line between a split-second decision to shield a convoy and a premeditated attack on a school. This demand for clarity is not a dodge. It is an appeal to the very standards that global institutions claim to defend. Reason 3 is process, the quiet architecture of respect. Governments expect to be consulted when a document that can reshape aid, partnerships, and public trust is about to land. Consultation is not a courtesy. It is a recognition that sovereignty is a process as much as a flag. When officials in Ouagadougou say they were not meaningfully engaged before publication, they hear more than a scheduling failure. They hear an old register of paternalism, the tone that says, decisions about you can be made without you, and you will be informed after the fact. In a region where outside judgments have too often arrived as pronouncements, process is the difference between partnership and patronage. Even when facts are not in dispute, the steps matter because the steps are how you respect a state while you challenge it. That is why consultation matters even when the content would not change. It builds trust in the steps, not only in the outcome. It gives a nation the right to challenge a claim before it becomes a label. It allows the painful work of correction and accountability to be done without the poison of humiliation. When the process disappears, even a careful sentence can sound like a sentence pronounced. It is important to say what this anger is not. It is not an attempt to erase wrongdoing or to hide behind patriotism like a curtain. It is frustration at procedure that feels like verdict. It is the insistence that a nation under attack still deserves to be treated as a nation at the table, not a subject in a case study. To the drafters, the listing is procedural. It is not a moral equivalence. That claim is understood. But nuance fades when you put soldiers and terrorists side by side on paper. In a life lived under threat, a comma can feel like a blade turned sideways. Return to the comparison that makes this visceral to a distant audience. Would the United States accept being equated with Al-Qaeda? Would France accept being listed alongside ISIS? No capital accepts the idea that its defenders are indistinguishable from the enemies they fight, especially when the allegation arrives without the evidentiary scaffolding that a court would demand. Burkina Faso is no different. The only difference is that its case is often argued in rooms where it does not sit, and its reputation is often weighed in a language that does not carry its scars. There is also memory in the reaction, the long memory of black liberation in Africa. For generations, outside descriptions have had the power to define African actors before those actors finished speaking. Labels were pasted on movements and leaders, on choices made under pressure, on failures, and on courage alike. That memory is not an abstract grievance. It is a ledger of how names have been turned into narratives, and how narratives have turned into policies. When a new list arrives that seems to carry an old habit, the response is not only political, it is ancestral. It says, we will not let the grammar of global concern erase our cadence again. This is where African sovereignty becomes more than a phrase in a communiqué. It is felt as the right to define yourself in a world that is comfortable defining you. In the Sahel, the idea of African independence is not a museum piece. It is the living insistence that the story of a war will not be written only by hands that do not bleed in it. You can hear that insistence in the way people say the word dignity and in the way they turn away from cameras that arrive to collect pain but not context. Step back into the rooms where this anger congealed into action. Advisors flipped through pages and highlighted lines. Commanders texted photos from the field, images of burned trucks, of mined culverts, of school walls held long enough for children to run. Civil society leaders worried about how the label would shape humanitarian access tomorrow morning. Ministers counted the ways a list could become a policy at a donor meeting. Everyone understood that narratives are not neutral. They are instruments. A report can be a mirror that helps you see what must change. It can also be a label that travels faster than the truth it claims to serve. This is why the outrage felt like a defense of dignity rather than a temper against criticism. A nation cannot afford to be thin-skinned when the stakes are survival. But a nation cannot afford to let its defenders be written as indistinguishable from its attackers either. That is not a matter of ego. That is the center of the social contract. Citizens will not send their children to a school guarded by men whom the world treats as no different from the men who would burn it. If African independence means anything in practice, it means refusing that collapse of meaning. It means drawing a bright line between protection and predation, and insisting that outsiders see it too. None of this absolves anyone who harms a child. None of this says the report should have stayed silent. It says that the grammar of protection must include consultation, context, and evidence worthy of the accusations it carries. It says that African sovereignty is not an argument against accountability, but a demand that accountability travel with the same rigor it claims to enforce. In that sense, the anger was not a refusal to listen. It was a refusal to be labeled before being heard. So the nation exploded. Not in chaos, but in clarity. Statements were drafted. Calls were made. The podium was prepared. The message that began as a murmur in the market rose to the microphone. By the time the cameras were lined up and the flags stood still behind the lectern, the choice had been made to answer the list with a decision. The next scene will take us to that decision, where words like persona non grata stop being a phrase in a textbook and become a line drawn in public. The murmur became a message. The message became a decision. By the time the cameras blinked awake and the microphones warmed under the lights, the nation had moved from outrage to action. A podium stood between flags. The room held its breath. This was the moment when a comma on a page would meet a line spoken out loud. The spokesman did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He read the sentence that would travel farther than any convoy. The government declared the United Nations resident coordinator persona non grata on the territory of Burkina Faso. In a single phrase, what had felt like humiliation became a boundary. What had read like a verdict without a court became a diplomatic decision with a date and a signature. In headlines, it would appear as Burkina Faso, UN expulsion. In homes across the country, it sounded like the defense of dignity, spoken as policy. Persona non grata is not a slogan. It is a tool embedded in the Vienna Convention that states use when they believe an envoy has lost credibility or crossed a line. It is not a jail door. It is a door shown politely but firmly. It says, "We will no longer accept this voice as our primary channel." In some capitals, the phrase lands like routine. In Ouagadougou, it landed like a thunderclap because it carried more than a personnel decision. It announced a posture. Once the words were spoken, the room shifted from silence to questions. Reporters asked about humanitarian coordination and the future of programs. Officials answered that the country was not shutting the door on the United Nations, only closing one door that no longer led to trust. They insisted that institutions were welcome and that partners were needed, but that a particular arrangement had broken the basic rule of respect. The subtext was simple. If you want to operate here, you must understand what it means to respect African sovereignty, not as a tagline, but as a working principle. Outside the building, the announcement moved through the city the way news moves now. It was carried by radio, by the fierce currency of social media, by street conversations that stretch from stalls of tomatoes to the steps of clinics. For some, the decision felt like a risk. For many, it felt like a restoration. A state that had been listed, now stood up and spoke back in the only register that could not be misread. Ibrahim TRAORÉ persona non grata was not the headline. The headline was that the government claimed the right to decide who speaks for the world in its living room. When a small nation expels a United Nations official, is it isolation or is it sovereignty in action? The answer depends on where you stand. From the viewpoint of agencies that must coordinate aid under fire, the expulsion can look like a blow to children who cannot wait for politics to heal. From the viewpoint of a government that believes it was judged without due process, the expulsion looks like the only available instrument that speaks the grammar of power in a world that hears power before it hears pain. There was, to be fair, a counter-narrative that arrived almost as quickly as the decision. The UN Controversy Africa frame said the move would hamper relief, slow coordination, and send the wrong signal to donors. Some international voices warned that drawing lines with escorts instead of pens would cost lives. These concerns were not invented. They came from the concrete challenges of moving food, securing corridors, and staffing clinics in areas where the ground rules shift with the wind. But the government's answer was consistent with what you have heard since Chapter 1. This was not a rejection of accountability. It was a rejection of being labeled before being heard. Officials repeated that the state would work with agencies committed to protection and to truth, and that replacing one envoy did not replace the international system. In other words, this was not an exit, it was a reset. Watch how the choice reverberated. In barracks, some soldiers heard the news as a rare day when political language recognized their moral burden. In markets, some sellers worried that aid delays would lace through the lean months. In civil society offices, advocates split the difference, insisting that both dignity and delivery had to be protected in the same breath. The argument was not whether children must be shielded, it was how to do it without erasing the legitimacy of the shield. The podium moment also traveled beyond the borders. In the Sahel, neighbors had their own memories of expulsions and reshuffles. The pattern looked familiar because the region has been rewriting its diplomatic grammar for several years. The posture of deference has given way to a posture of negotiation. Even critics admitted that the announcement had clarity. No one could mistake what the country meant. In that clarity, some saw a template, others a warning, and many a new stage of African geopolitics in which the balance between cooperation and control would be tested in public. There is a legal layer worth naming. Persona non grata does not determine who was right about any particular claim in a report. It determines who a state believes can credibly partner with it to address those claims. In that sense, the act sits at the intersection of law and trust. If trust is broken, the law provides a tool. If the tool is used, trust does not automatically repair. It has to be rebuilt with new faces and clearer methods. The government knew this, the agencies knew this. Everyone understood that the day after the expulsion would be the test of whether the reset could function. What did that day look like? Meetings were rescheduled, interim coordinators took calls. Field missions reviewed their security and access plans. Ministries asked for documentation that went beyond bullet points and categories and moved into the territory of chain of custody and verifiable detail. The symbolic earthquake began to settle into administrative aftershocks. The drama of the announcement turned into the grind of governance. In that grind, the stakes remained the same. Protect children, protect dignity, protect the fragile trust that allows both to happen at once. Listen again to the echo from Chapter 3. This anger is not a cover for wrongdoing. It is the assertion that African independence means the right to demand process while you pursue protection. In that light, the expulsion was an argument made in the language the world respects. A small nation cannot summon an aircraft carrier. It can summon a clause in a convention and use it with full voice. This is the logic of sovereignty when you do not own the loudest megaphone. You own the right to decide who speaks into your microphone. As the day closed, the chant of debate gave way to a quieter question. Would this decision open a door to better cooperation or close doors that the most vulnerable need to stay open? The answer would not be written in a statement. It would be written in how quickly relief convoys moved, how confidently schools reopened, how well new channels could balance transparency with urgency. That is where the story goes next. to the regional and global currents that made this moment legible, and to the wider canvas where a single line at a podium becomes a chapter in a larger shift. The podium is empty now. The words remain. The action is real. Persona non grata is more than a phrase on a law school exam. It is a line drawn in public by a nation that insists on being treated as a nation. In the next chapter, we will pull the camera back and see the pattern across the Sahel. We will ask whether this was a solitary strike of defiance or part of a movement that is redrawing the map of partnership on the continent. We will see how a decision in Ouagadougou fits into the long arc of African sovereignty and the practical demands of protection that cannot wait for perfect peace. Pull the camera back. The podium in Ouagadougou is one frame in a wider reel. Burkina Faso is not alone. To the west and north, Mali and Niger have tightened their own terms with the United Nations, the European Union, and France. Different histories, different calendars, same friction. What looked like one flash is, in truth, a weather system. In this system, a phrase has moved from talk to practice. Sahel Alliance. It is less a slogan than a coordinating method, a way for neighbors to align security operations and diplomatic stances at the same time. When one capital changes its tone, it is news. When three do, it is a turning point in African geopolitics. The old map of who leads and who follows no longer matches the ground. There is a lineage to this moment. You can hear it in the echoes of Thomas Sankara. Independence is not satisfied by flags and anthems. It must be practiced in budgets, in borders, and in the courage to say no when the price of yes is dignity. That is the living core of Pan-Africanism. It is not a museum piece. It is a working compass that asks states to resist being played one against another and to act in chorus when interests and values meet. If some call this the African Revolution 2025, it is because the region is testing a simple claim. Cooperation on its own terms can protect more people than compliance on someone else's. The economic frame is changing too. A decade ago, Africa Rising sounded like a growth headline. Today, the question is sharper. Who writes the risk? Who prices the pain? Who decides when a partner becomes a patron? That is where BRICS Africa enters the room. Not as an automatic exit from older ties, but as leverage in a marketplace of power. More options, change voices. A country that can pivot accepts fewer lectures. A region that can coordinate absorbs less blame it did not write. Critics warn of real risks. Break with established partners, and you may trade one dependency for another, with fewer safeguards for rights and transparency. They are not wrong to worry. Pan-Africanism is a compass, not an autopilot. The hard work of accountability and inclusion does not disappear because a communique sounds proud. A revolution that forgets its citizens is not a revolution. It is a costume. Supporters answer with the ledger of experience. The prior grammar failed long before these governments changed the script. Mandates did not secure roads. Missions did not heal the fracture between capital and countryside. Reports did not stop the slow bleeding of schools and clinics. Resetting the terms, they say, is not vanity. It is triage. Listen to the street and you will hear both songs. Pride in the posture, anxiety in the price. Markets run on hope as much as cash. Hope that convoys pass, clinics stay staffed, and classrooms keep their doors. The wager is that dignity can buy time and trust, and that time and trust can buy security and services. So ask the question that hangs over the horizon. Is this the fall of old colonial influence or the rise of African sovereignty? The honest answer is that it is both less and more. Less because empires do not fade in a day. More because drawing lines in public is how sovereignty learns to walk without asking permission. The storm is wider than one capital now, and for once it belongs to the people who live beneath it. Lower the camera. Leave the podium and the flags. Stand in the heat where decisions land as noise or relief. If Chapter 5 widened the frame, this chapter steps closer, until you can hear the breath between a question and an answer. The street carries two songs, pride and worry, but they share a drum. Justice. Dignity. Freedom. For generations, Black Americans were criminalized by default. Institutions called us guilty before we spoke. That is how Burkina Faso feels today. The voice is calm, but the words carry weight. In Oakland and Ouagadougou, people recognize the contour of a label that moves faster than facts. Some call this comparison too neat. On the ground, it is not neat. It is intimate. It is the memory of being named before being known. Here is a mother outside a clinic, palms clasped around a paper bag of medicine. She says the report might be true in parts, but the way it was written made her feel like the men at the checkpoint are the same as the men who burned the market. She does not study matrices. She reads fear on her child's face and the relief when a convoy gets through. Her words are a lesson in African politics, explained without jargon. Protection is a verb, not a press release. Here is a young volunteer fighter, 22, dust on his sleeves. A phone full of messages from family who tell him to eat, to pray, to keep his head down when night falls. He does not want a blank check. He wants the world to distinguish between a choice made under fire to move a truck of flour and a crime. He wants someone to ask whether the witnesses fled, whether the road changed hands twice before noon, whether the rumor that became a bullet point had a source or a shadow. He prefers a hard truth to a lazy label. Here is a teacher, chalk snapping between her fingers, who wonders how many more times a report will land like a weather warning without a map. She remembers hearing about traffic stops in the United States that began as procedure and became humiliation. How 1,000 small encounters wrote a larger story of distrust. She says, maybe that is why people here felt the blow. The grammar sounded familiar. The presumption wore a different badge, but it walked the same way. This is where the Black American conscience connects to Black liberation in Africa without speeches, through the muscle memory of being judged before being heard. The parallels are not perfect. They are human. They live in the shared insistence that justice must start with listening, that dignity is not a favor from institutions but a right carried into every room. If there is a Pan-African movement worth the name, it begins with the refusal to let any system erase the cadence of a people's voice. You can hear that cadence in churches and mosques, in the way prayers fold the names of towns that fight to keep their schools open. You can hear it in music that travels farther than policy memos, in verses that carry the old promise forward. It says, freedom is not only the absence of chains, it is the presence of respect. It says, sovereignty is not the end of accountability. It is the start of accountability that does not require permission to be believed. The diaspora bridges the two shores. A student at a historically Black college writes to a cousin in Bobo Dioulasso, asking what help means that does not become supervision. A nurse in Minneapolis sends money without hashtags because the clinic needs gloves more than it needs a sermon. A pastor in Atlanta prays for children who walk to class under a guard's eye, and for guards who go home with stories they cannot tell aloud. On both sides, people ask for protection that does not tease dignity from the equation, as if the two could survive separately. None of this romanticizes the ground. There are mistakes, abuses, and grief that does not fit into slogans. There are communities that feel pressed by both insurgents and the state, caught in the vice of proximity and suspicion. That is why the call from the ground sounds like this. Count us carefully. Do not make us footnotes in conflicts you summarize for convenience. If you write a list, walk the road you are listing. If you make a label, bring the chain of custody with you, not just the chain of command. Here is the counterpoint, because honesty demands it. Aid workers remind us that coordination saves lives, and that expelling or reshuffling envoys can slow a response that cannot afford delay. They are not the enemy. They are the ones who carry vaccines through heat and doubt. The ground asks them to stay, and to stay differently, with ears open and measures agreed upon in rooms where locals sit first, not last. Partnership without presumption is not poetry. It is logistics that respects the people it serves. If this sounds like a sermon, it is because history made it one. Every community that has lived beneath a presumption knows the cost in blood pressure and silence. Every nation that has fought to define itself knows the heat that rises when someone else writes the story's ending before the second act. The promise that ties Black America to Burkina Faso is not a shared villain. It is a shared vow. We will not let institutions turn our lives into exhibits. We will tell you where it hurts and how we heal, and we will expect you to listen as if you plan to live with us when the cameras leave. So the question at the end of this chapter is not abstract. Will the world protect children and still protect the dignity of those who guard their classrooms? Will global concern learn the cadence of local speech? Will the list become a mirror rather than a scar? The answer will not be written in a hashtag. It will be written in convoys that arrive, in audits that prove their claims, in a microphone that makes it the accident. Bring the frame even closer. A face under a beret. A voice that favors brief sentences over applause lines. Boots that carry dust from garrisons to markets and back again. What you are seeing is not only a politician at a podium. It is a symbol being carved in real time. A figure many in the Sahel read as a defender of sovereignty, rather than a seeker of celebrity. In a season of lists and labels, Ibrahim TRAORÉ stands as a line drawn by hand. Symbol is not a substitute for service. The reason the image carries weight is that it meets a hunger that has outlived many mandates. People want a leader who speaks as if he plans to stay when the cameras leave. In convoy visits, in late-night briefings, in the cadence of an Ibrahim TRAORÉ speech, and an Ibrahim TRAORÉ speech that travel faster than the press release that follows them, the message is simple and stubborn. Security is not a contract you outsource. Dignity is not a grant you apply for. If the country is to recover, it must own both the burden and the blueprint, even when allies are in the room. Is Captain TRAORÉ just defending a report? Or is he defending the very meaning of African independence? The answer depends on how you hear the word defend. In the narrow sense, yes, he rejects a document that he believes erased the distinction between a shield and a blade. In the larger sense, his stance targets the habits behind the document. It says that cooperation must be earned by respect, that consultation is not a courtesy, and that sovereignty is a working principle measured in how partners behave when the cameras are gone. The echo of Sankara is loud here, but it is not a copy. Thomas Sankara taught that independence lives in budgets, in borders, and in the courage to say no when the price of yes is dignity. TRAORÉ inherits that lesson in a harder season. His Burkina Faso faces insurgents who test roads and patience every week. His choices are less about poetry and more about corridors and convoys. Yet the line is visible. Refuse the posture of dependency. Build with what you have, while you fight for what you need. Tie patriotism to performance, not to slogans. Pan-Africanism also moves from speech to practice in this chapter of the story. The Sahel Alliance did not appear to provide applause. It appeared because three capitals learned that standing apart made it easier to be managed. Standing together makes it harder to be ignored. In meetings where security and development once arrived as separate binders, the new habit is to open them on the same table. That is what a modern Pan-African movement looks like, under fire. It is not an abstract doctrine. It is a method of survival. Speak with supporters of this turn, and they will point to a set of aims they call Ibrahim TRAORÉ projects and Ibrahim TRAORÉ projects. The list is not a museum of promises. It is a cluster of practical priorities that pull in the same direction. Secure school roads long enough for classes to hold. Stabilize supply lines so clinics keep staff and medicine. Push for more domestic value in the gold economy rather than exporting raw hope. Improve training and rules of engagement so that protection does not blur into abuse. None of these aims make good slogans. They make better lives if they work. Critics answer with cautions that deserve air. They warn that a revolution without guardrails can spin into conformity. They ask whether the same voice that speaks against paternalism will tolerate dissent when the pressure rises. They insist that accountability must not be a word reserved for outsiders. These are not hostile questions. They are the questions that keep a movement honest. The reply you hear from many citizens is not a dismissal, it is a timeline. First, secure enough ground to make democratic argument possible again. Then argue like a nation that plans to keep itself honest. The tension with old partners is most often framed as TRAORÉ versus France. That frame is too small, but it points to a truth. The argument is not with a passport. It is with a pattern. Deals written far away and delivered as if geography were consent. Programs measured in reports that skip the names of villages where the outcomes actually happen. To change that pattern is not to shut the door on the world. It is to move the hinge so the door opens from the inside. Listen to the language when the president speaks. It is not smooth for its own sake. It is deliberate. He talks about time as both a weapon and a wound. He speaks about courage as a public utility, not a private virtue. He defines victory as the day when a convoy is boring and a school day is long. In that vocabulary, you can hear why some call this the African Revolution. 2025. Not because a calendar demands a climax, but because a generation is refusing the postponement of adulthood. They want institutions that act like they are accountable to those who bleed for them. What does this stance cost? It costs comfort. It attracts scrutiny. It forces a small state to operate with the discipline of a larger one because mistakes now travel at the speed of narrative. It also buys something that cannot be borrowed: self-respect. The pride of a soldier who believes the mission will not be edited into shame by distant hands. The calm of a parent who believes the guard at the gate is not on probation in the court of someone else's opinion. There is a practical test for any symbol. Does it change behavior? In ministries, are audits deeper and timelines shorter? In barracks, are codes of conduct clearer and supplies more reliable? In markets, are price shocks answered with plans that reach the last stall? The coming months will answer whether the image of a defender of sovereignty translates into an architecture that protects the vulnerable. A symbol that cannot be measured by outcomes is a story that expires. Return to the question that keeps this chapter honest. Is Captain Traoré just defending a report, or is he defending the very meaning of African independence? The cleanest answer is to say he is doing both in sequence. Refuting an unfair list is the visible act. Rewriting the terms of partnership is the deeper project. If the first succeeds, the second becomes possible. If the second succeeds, no list will land the same way again. So the camera pulls back one step but does not leave. The voice continues in the room as the work moves outside it. This is not the end of a speech, it is a beginning that refuses to apologize for its ambition. The Burkina Faso Revolution will be measured not in slogans but in the distance a convoy can travel and the number of doors a school can keep open. Until then, the echo of Sankara remains a guide, not a ghost. And the sentence that matters most is the one the country writes for itself. Now the dust settles and what remains is clarity. A United Nations report placed Burkina Faso soldiers and terrorists on the same list of violators. And that legalistic act ignited a firestorm of national defiance. From market whispers to ministry memos, from checkpoints at dawn to microphones at noon, the arc held steady. Insult, outrage, decision. The country answered a label with a line, and in that line you could read a simple claim to sovereignty. Calm did not mean surrender, it meant control. The government challenged the report's grammar, demanded evidence worthy of its allegations, and insisted on consultation as the ordinary syntax of respect. Beyond the capital, families felt the difference between a shield and a blade affirmed in public. Across the Sahel, neighbors recognized the posture because they had begun to stand the same way. Inside the diaspora, the echo reached those who know what it means to be named before being known. Justice, dignity, freedom, the three words that kept time beneath every chapter. This film has not asked you to choose a villain. It has asked you to listen for nuance, to honor the urgency of protecting children while refusing the ease of flattening a nation. It has argued that sovereignty and accountability must travel together, or neither will arrive. It has shown that symbols matter only when they become service, that speeches matter only when convoys move and classrooms stay open. So here's the question we carry into the credits. Comment, share, and tell us, when global institutions overstep, who holds them accountable? If a list is to be a mirror, not a scar, it must be made with the people who live beneath its lines, not only with those who read it from afar. The lights dim, but the wager remains. So, the question remains, in the fight for sovereignty, does defiance equal freedom? For Captain Traoré and the people of Burkina Faso, that is a calculation they are willing to bet their nation's future on.